Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the 2018 Qualified Allocation Plan Amendment Update webinar.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this discussion of proposed amendments to the 2018 Qualified Allocation Plan. As we go through the webinar, you'll see more about why we're discussing the 2018 Qualified Allocation Plan amendment now, as well as what the timing will be going forward. What we're going to do today is give a little bit of context and background for you about the use of tax-exempt bonds for housing in Minnesota, some history on that, and what has changed in the last year or so that has brought us to consider making some changes to the qualified allocation plan that accompanies tax-exempt bonding for rental housing. We're going to go over the detail of the QAP changes that were proposed and the public comment responses that we received. We'll be reviewing some subsequent changes that we've made and then go over our plan for continued dialogue. So if at any time you're confused or have questions, anything that any of us says gives you pause, please feel free to enter a question in the chat box, and we will make sure we field your question as we go along. Just as a reminder, some of you may be more or less familiar with Minnesota housing, but we do have a strategic plan that was adopted last year, and that the vision in our strategic plan is that all Minnesotans will live in a safe, affordable home they can afford in a community of their choice. Our mission, because housing is a foundation for success, we collaborate with individuals, communities, and partners to create, preserve, and finance affordable housing. In our strategic plan, we laid out 5 priorities. This doesn't cover everything that we do. We last year put about $1 billion in housing resources into the marketplace, but these 5 priorities show you where we're putting special focus in this strategic plan priority time. The first is preserving housing with federal project-based rent assistance. That's been a priority of this agency really for about the last 20 years, as we find that increasingly housing that has rent assistance attached to it is extremely important in a tight marketplace. We fight to prevent and end homelessness and have made some gains there. We finance housing that's responsive to Minnesota's changing demographics, and so as we see more households of color, more need for workforce housing outstate, and also senior housing, you'll see our programs changing to reflect that. We address specific and critical local housing needs. This really reflects the fact that we work with communities all over the state to learn what their particular housing needs are and how we might work together with them to address those needs. And finally, in our single-family programs, we work to reduce Minnesota's racial and ethnic homeownership disparity. And that means more first-time homebuyer mortgages for households of color. We also, in our strategic plan, outlined a few guiding principles. I haven't put all of them here, but 3 of them that I thought were relevant to our discussion today. First, we use scarce resources to best meet strategic priorities as shaped by the needs of local communities. So we really try to pay attention to what the overarching needs are, advise with local communities, and then try to put together the best package. We use resources in ways that meet multiple policy goals and leverage other resources whenever possible. And we try to be flexible in our approach so that our decisions reflect current market conditions and community needs. So speaking of changing market conditions, since the election, which wasn't all that long ago, that is pertinent to the discussion we'll be having today. Some of you may be very aware that the low-income housing tax credit marketplace is in a lot of flux with potential for tax reform. There is talk in the next Congress of lower corporate tax rates, and there's also talk of other provisions that would impact investor yields potentially. Also, in that same time period, interest rates on long-term financing have increased by about 50 basis points, or 0.5% on long-term mortgages. And what those two top things mean is that in the multifamily world, there are some projects that probably won't work under these new conditions because the numbers were kind of tight even before these two changes happened. And we're also learning that because of the uncertainty of the potential changes by Congress in taxes, that some investors have retreated temporarily to the sidelines. We don't think that either of these conditions is permanent, but we do know that there's a lot of discussion in the marketplace right now about whether there will be bids available for low-income housing tax credits for certain types of projects, whether investors will be willing to make long-term commitments to projects that recently received 9% credits, whether those bids will be forthcoming. So it's really a case-by-case basis. I don't want to cede too much concern, but I will say that those changing market conditions are definitely being taken into consideration by us as we consider what, if any, changes to the 2018 Qualified Allocation Plan we will recommend to our board in January. With that, we're going to take just a minute with Ryan Baumtrug, our Assistant Commissioner for Policy and Community Development, to walk through a little bit of context for you on the use of tax-exempt bonding, particularly for housing in Minnesota.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Ryan Baumtrug. I'm the Assistant Commissioner for Policy and Community Development here at Minnesota Housing. And as the Commissioner mentioned, I wanted to spend a few moments here to provide an overview of tax-exempt bonding related to housing in Minnesota before we get into some of the details about the QAP changes that we're proposing. So a little bit about what led us to where we are today. And many of you on the phone are aware of this, but tax-exempt bonds are a valuable tool in Minnesota. They're a federal resource that Minnesota has utilized for a wide range of uses, including single-family home ownership and multifamily development for numerous years. One of the things that we've been looking at is, in Minnesota specifically, is just how creative and flexible we have been in the state in utilizing those resources. In fact, we're one of only 10 states over the past years that hasn't turned back any of our federal authority because it couldn't be used. And so we've been creative at times when the resource wasn't being deployed as much. I think a great example to use there is in 2012, Minnesota Housing, working with stakeholders, including the legislature, created housing infrastructure bonds as a source of gap funding to help with tax-exempt bond deals and 4% credit deals. At the same time, we've also tried to be flexible as the resources have become more scarce, particularly this year. We've looked at different ways to finance home ownership and do more taxable bond sales in order to stretch the resources to go further. So a little bit about where we are right now is that it really is a perfect storm that has created the scarcity of the bonding authority. We have some really good things that are happening in Minnesota, that higher incomes can generate higher rents and a higher first mortgage. Credit pricing is great, and low interest rates. Right now, all allow deals to come forward that utilize less gap funds or less deferred funds from Minnesota Housing and are able to access or able to complete projects using tax credits and tax-exempt bonds. So a little time I wanted to spend talking about the tax-exempt bonding in Minnesota. So Minnesota Housing is one of many actors involved in tax-exempt bonding. We're one of 4 entitlement issuers, along with Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Dakota County. And we also are part of the pools that are administered by Minnesota Management and Budget. So in 2016, the total amount of tax-exempt bonding was $550 million, as you can see on the screen, and it was split between entitlement issuers as well as pools administered by Minnesota Management and Budget, and that includes a housing pool, the small issue pool, which is used for student loans and manufacturing issuances, and a public facilities pool. So this is the landscape in which Minnesota Housing and cities and communities across the state are looking at as now this resource that in past years has not been scarce, has become increasingly scarce. As we look at a current example of the housing pool specifically, so this is a pool that in 2016 received $182 million for home ownership and rental projects. You can see that over the past years, there's been a balance of funds that have gone unused from the housing pool. Going back to 2007 was actually the last time the funds weren't fully utilized in the state housing pool. So over the past number of years, we've seen fairly significant resources that are available for both homeownership activities as well as residential rental projects, where there's been money available in the housing pool that has been available to finish and complete projects across the state. What we're experiencing now, and what has led to us proposing changes to the QAP and looking at how we're financing single family in different ways, is the dramatic decline from $144 million in 2015 to $4 million in 2016, so effectively zero. So you can really see the market factors that I talked about a couple slides ago and the impact that that's having. You can see the drastic increase in utilization in a statewide resource in this current year, where over the previous years the competition and scarcity just didn't exist. One thing that we're thinking about moving forward and hearing about is speculation about 2017 and the likelihood that we could see requests of the housing pool itself exceed over $250 million. So that largely is why we're here today, to talk about that issue. Just for a little context too, the state of Minnesota broadly has deployed tax-exempt volume cap for housing to a great extent over the past years. We, again, are a state that has utilized it successfully for home ownership and rental. And when it hasn't been scarce, we've been able to look for tools, as I mentioned earlier, to utilize all the authority. One thing that, with our collective support for rental housing projects statewide, our use of housing infrastructure bonds alone has helped create nearly 1,900 units since 2012, making the use of tax-exempt bond funds that potentially otherwise would have expired. As we've used it, as Minnesota Housing has used tax-exempt bonds for home ownership, we've created thousands of first-time home buyers across the state and helped address the home ownership gap between white households and households of color. And it's our single-family lending activity that allows us to provide additional affordable housing resources, such as down payment and closing cost assistance, that help make home ownership possible. So in a number of years since the recession, Minnesota Bonding Authority would have expired if we hadn't used it for home ownership. And that's largely what you can see up on the screen, is that within a given year, how these resources get deployed for affordable housing may change, but ultimately it's the markets at the time and the availability to use these resources and not have them be go unused that has really allowed Minnesota Housing and the state at large to utilize these resources throughout the state. One thing to point out, especially as it relates to rental housing, is the change in 2016, where $400 million in tax-exempt bonds is estimated to be used for rental, while $232 million will be used for home ownership. So with that as context and background about this resource and the use across the state for both rental and home ownership, I'm going to turn it over to Kayla Shuckman.
Good afternoon. My name is Kayla Shuckman, and I'm the manager of multifamily programs at Minnesota Housing. In this next section, I'm going to provide some background on 4% tax credits and the agency's 2018 Qualified Allocation Plan. So you might be wondering why we are going to talk about 4% tax credits. 4% tax credits become very relevant when discussing tax-exempt bonding, as developers that use private activity tax-exempt bonds are eligible to access 4% tax credits. Minnesota Housing is responsible for publishing the Qualified Allocation Plan, also called the QAP, which describes how tax credits can be used, and if tax-exempt bonds are a scarce resource, the QAP can ensure that high-priority developments can access the resources they need. The Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program is a federal resource that provides tax credits to companies and people that invest in affordable rental housing, reducing their federal tax liability by the amount of the tax credit for 10 years. In exchange for the reduction in tax liability, investors purchase the tax credits and, in exchange, agree to keep units affordable to households earning 60% of area median income or less. The sale proceeds from the credits are then used to build new affordable housing or to acquire and rehabilitate existing property. So there are two types of tax credits referred to as 9% credits and 4% credits. The 9% credits are very scarce and offered in our annual request for proposals on a competitive basis with requests at least 3 to 4 times the amount of available resources. 4% credits are not a scarce resource and, however, are available only to a project when private activity tax-exempt bond financing is used. So while 4% credits aren't scarce, there has been a significant increase in demand for the tax-exempt bonding that makes a project eligible for these tax credits. Just to give you a sense of scope, if you're not familiar with this resource, if you're looking at a 100-unit project with approximately $600,000 in 4% tax credits, the tax credit equity proceeds for that development would probably be somewhere around $5 million. So a substantial piece of the total development costs. Each allocator of tax credits is required by federal law to have a qualified allocation plan that describes how tax credits will be used and how awards will be made. Minnesota Housing is the allocator for the state of Minnesota, but there are also 4 local suballocators, including Minneapolis, St. Paul, Dakota, and Washington counties. Minnesota Housing's 2018 QAP applies to the whole state except for these jurisdictions. In terms of timing, the 2018 QAP applies to projects which will have their first bond issuance in 2018. 4% tax credits with tax-exempt bonds have been used to support a variety of housing needs in the state and in communities across the state. Developers have constructed or rehabilitated senior, family, workforce, and supportive housing, often in mixed income settings. And in addition, the resource has been used to preserve projects with federal assistance, as well as historic buildings. A few years ago, Minnesota Housing moved to develop and publish our QAP on a timeline that would give stakeholders more time to plan. While historically the agency had published the QAP just 3 months prior to the application deadline, in recognition that stakeholders need more time to effectively prepare and respond to priorities, the agency began publishing the QAP over a year in advance of the application deadline. In line with this schedule, the 2018 QAP was released for public comment in February of this year, with final approval in May. In developing the initial and final QAP proposals, the agency sought feedback from stakeholders in a variety of ways. We held developer and tribal focus group sessions prior to publication in late 2015. We held a QAP overview session to give the public a better understanding of what was being proposed, as well as conducting a formal public hearing with written and oral comments. So while a lot of work and public dialogue went into the initial 2018 QAP, because there has been such a dramatic change in demand for bonding authority, we felt an amendment was necessary to discuss for the 2018 QAP rather than waiting an additional 2 years for the 2019 QAP year to respond to these unexpected market conditions. In the 2018 QAP that was adopted in May of this year, 2 primary changes were made that impacted 4% tax credit projects. First, the 2018 QAP restored the minimum score required for 4% tax credits to 40 points. The minimum score was reduced from 40 to 30 points in April of 2013 in response to a public comment pointing out that tax-exempt bonding authority was not at that time a scarce resource and was going unused. To maximize use of tax-exempt bonding for multifamily affordable housing development, the agency agreed to reduce the minimum score to 30 points. For the previous 10 years, the QAP had contained a minimum scoring requirement for 4% deals of 40 points, and prior to that it was 50. The second revision made to the QAP released in May was to limit the amount of tax-exempt bonds when Minnesota Housing is the issuer to 53% of total project costs. The additional changes that were proposed for the 2018 QAP amendment were to increase the minimum score required for 4% credits from 40 to 50 points, to require a 30-year affordability period with no opportunity to opt out of the income restrictions after year 15, to require all developments to meet one of the strategic priority policy thresholds in the QAP, to apply the agency's predictive model to all developments to ensure cost reasonableness, and to create a pre-application process to assist applicants in getting earlier feedback on these elements. In addition, several changes were initially proposed to the 2017 QAP. Since publication of the amendments, the agency has received feedback from 60-some commenters. Feedback is a crucial component of making good, well-thought-out policy changes, and we'd like to thank all of you who took the time to submit your written comments. The primary stakeholder groups we heard from include developers, contractors, cities, and advocacy groups. We heard a wide variety of concerns from stakeholders, including some concerned about being able to continue constructing family projects, others concerned about ability to construct senior projects. There was a wide range of different perspectives among commenters, but some major themes were concern about the ability to pursue local priorities, concern about the ability to pursue specific development types, and a desire for a longer and more robust public dialogue. Given the response that we heard through the public comment period, as well as the changing market conditions that both Mary and Ryan touched on, Minnesota Housing has responded by withdrawing the proposed amendment for the 2017 QAP. Additionally, we have extended the feedback period for the 2018 QAP amendments and added several opportunities for continued dialogue. So with that, I'll turn it over to Margaret Kaplan, our Director of Community Development, who will talk more about these opportunities.
We realized that we needed to do more outreach and engagement with our stakeholders based on some of the feedback that we received. And so with that in mind, we have a number of opportunities for folks to learn more about tax-exempt bonds and 4% credits and to provide feedback to the agency about some of the ideas to make sure that we are understanding what your community's needs are and that we're pulling together the best recommendation moving forward. So we're starting that out, obviously, with today's webinar with a little bit of background information. Next up, this Thursday, we have a number of sessions that are really geared at folks who are developers or experts in using tax-exempt bonds and 4% credits. Those are going to be this Thursday. We did a fair amount of outreach with the development community and have a number of people signed up. But if you are interested in joining in on those sessions, you should contact Rachel Franco at 651-296-3734. Following that, in January, we are going to have a couple of sessions with local stakeholders. And I have some information about one of those. We've been working with ULI Minnesota and the Family Housing Fund in order to pull together a session that's really geared at local policymakers, so cities and counties, folks who have been using 4% credits and tax-exempt bonds as a tool to meet their community's affordable housing needs, so we can understand a little bit more about the needs from a community perspective. That meeting is going to be on January 12th in St. Louis Park, and we're going to be providing more information about that to folks later on this week. And then, based on all of the feedback that we receive from stakeholders and from communities, we're going to create a revised proposal that we are going to send out for a public comment period. We're going to incorporate all of the input that we received in our public comment period, as well as information that we receive through these listening sessions to make sure that we have the best proposal possible. And that is going to go out for public comment. So we really would encourage you, when that goes out, probably at our January board meeting, to please let us know if you have any questions, concerns, or comments based on what we send out there. And then we're going to take the public comments we receive, and we're going to develop the final proposal that's going to go to our board for approval. And that's going to be happening in sometime in February or March, and we'll provide more details about that. And some of that timing will really be based on the number of comments we receive and how much tooling around we have to do with the qualified allocation plan. So that's our process moving forward. Once again, we are very committed to making sure that you're informed each step along the way so that you can participate in the process. I am going to pass it back to the Commissioner.
Thank you, everyone. With regard to any comments you have on the proposed amendments, contact Summer Jefferson at the address and phone number that you see up on the board. Thank you very much for joining us, and we had quite a great attendance for this, so thanks for taking the time.